Hello. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about anarchism, something that we started to talk about briefly once before. But today we have a different format, so we're learning something new. And let's get started. Some of this will be a little bit repetitive for some of you, but I want to do a kind of quick review of anarchism. So first of all, why anarchism? Where does that come from? Most people think of this as violence, as overthrowing things, as throwing gasoline canisters and so forth and so on. But anarchists were quite serious. They were also people who quite often had skills, skills of the old sort, the craft skills, that largely were being replaced by the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. So these, quite often, the philosophers who espoused anarchism and the workers who supported this kind of idea generally found themselves in a kind of predicament. They found that the institutions were growing that had not been there before, and they felt that those institutions were taking away their livelihood, their lives. Industry was replacing the crafts. New states were emerging that were more powerful, more centralized, armies, national armies, standing armies. All this in the wake of the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, the political revolution, the twin revolutions of Eric Hobsbawm, the industrial and the political, that characterized much of the 19th century and even into the 20th century. So why anarchism? What were the causes? Why this particular way of looking at things? Why did it emerge? Well, a number of things. For example, it was response to big government, which had not been quite so big before. And the tentacles of government, of course, are there. You begin to get new tax laws. You begin to get new sorts of obligations that people have to meet to a state that simply wasn't so intrusive before, and certainly not in this way. You also get military service, something that had been around, but not quite at the same magnitude as will be occurring in the 19th century. The big Napoleonic armies and the armies of opposition, those become the standing armies, the citizens' armies. All that becomes much more characteristic of the 19th century. And of course, all of that is something which is imposing on people as never before. Large bureaucracies, the governments can keep track of people, something that we know of today. And of course, then there was the resentment of the loss of status, of people's jobs. Their skills were being eroded, being replaced by not craftsmen, but by industrial workers who were lesser skilled. All that is developing in the 19th century. And it's not a big surprise that anarchism is going to emerge in the wake of that. Let me begin by talking about somebody that we mentioned earlier. And I'm talking about Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, whose years are 1809 to 1865. Proudhon was a rather imposing figure. He gave Marx fits, Karl Marx, he gave them fits because they had very different views about what socialism should look like. Anarchists quite often shared a lot of the socialist ideals along with the socialists of the time, only they didn't have the same view of history. They didn't have the same view of how victory could actually come about for working men who felt like they were losing virtually everything. So what is he all about? Well, for one thing, Proudhon, like all socialists, believed that all value was created by labor. Not a surprise, since he comes out of a kind of a skilled craft background himself. And he did feel very strongly, it wasn't just a theoretical measure for him, but it was something that was actually very practical, because he felt like people were losing control of their lives. They were losing control of the means of production. They all of a sudden found themselves not only being replaced, but they found that the larger factories, workshops, and then larger factories, although large factories emerged only later, but they found that all this was beginning to change their status in life, and also not only their status in life, but the way in which they went about work. No longer the same skills are required, and not only that, whereas before many skilled workers were fairly independent, fairly autonomous, owned their own means of production, their looms or whatever. Now they don't have the same means. They don't have the same ownership. The mechanical looms and so forth that begin to emerge are going to be found in factories. They're going to be owned by factory owners. And all of a sudden, where you were more or less independent before, you now had a boss, somebody you had to answer to. You now had hours you had to be at the factory. You now had, or the workshop, larger workshop. You had hours that you had to remain there, and work days were quite long in the earlier mills and the early factories and so on and so forth. So Proudhon experiences all this, and he sees others experiencing it. So what is he all about? It's basically is about property is theft. That was a sort of standard wording for Proudhon. Property is theft. That is to say, property is unpaid labor. For Proudhon, who has his own theory of the value of labor, the value of surplus labor, the value of labor essentially is everything that labor produced should belong to the worker, right? Workers are the ones who are producing everything. How is it all of a sudden in this new development, which we'll call capitalism, right? Capitalism all of a sudden establishes all sorts of relationships which seem to put workers into a sort of a web over which they no longer have the control that they had before. So now you have this problem, and Proudhon said, well, property essentially is unpaid labor. So what does he think should be done about it? Well, he feels that the governments that have emerged, the large states, let's call them states, that they are there only to protect the new owner, the owners of the imposing workshops and factories that are emerging. That the main purpose really of the state in relationship to work is essentially to protect the capitalist, right? To help the capitalist extract value from the worker. So property is theft, and theft is supported by the state. The government, according to Proudhon, is essentially run by the rich to exploit the poor. What did Proudhon believe? He believed that workers should organize themselves in their own syndicates. He believed that workers would be much better off. They would be autonomous again. Therefore, syndicates should become the basis of the production of the future, a little bit maybe like guilds in an earlier period, but workers, in other words, would take back control. And he really believed that these syndicates would be organized, they would be voluntary, that workers would organize themselves, and the whole idea of the syndicate, which is, you could think of it as a union, but it's a little bit more than a union, because the syndicate isn't just a union which is there to negotiate with capitalists. The syndicate, the whole idea of the syndicate is to bypass the capitalists, to bypass the state, because the syndicate would not only organize the economy and workers would control it, but the syndicate would also replace the state. So, well, you say wishful thinking, maybe so. But what he meant was, instead of a strong national state, workers would be much better off if they controlled things locally. If work was done locally, if it was controlled locally, and the workers themselves organized the market. So it wouldn't be a market in the same sense as capitalist relationships, right? For Proudhon, one could argue about what that would look like, but in any case, it would look like more or less workers negotiating among themselves, exchanging among themselves, and not needing the capitalists anymore, because workers would be able to control their own production in that way. That was his whole idea. That's what anarchism meant to him. So he wants to essentially bypass the state. He wants to essentially short circuit the market, and he wants to bring production back under the control of workers. And by the way, this is very, very, the whole idea of this is actually very democratic. The idea is to essentially put people back in control of their lives, their work and their lives. So in that sense, you could say that anarchism is not only a kind of a socialism, but it's also a kind of a democratic socialism. And you may ask, was that Bernie Sanders? No, not exactly Bernie Sanders, but here it is. Democratic socialism means local control. It means people controlling their own lives. It means people controlling their own lives so they're not exploited. Well, that's Proudhon. Let's talk about one other figure, a very imposing figure himself, the great Leo Tolstoy, Count Tolstoy, the aristocrat whose years are 1828 to 1910. As we know, Tolstoy was the great novelist, of course. And we all know about War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and a number of other works. But Tolstoy was also an anarchist, and he wrote about it. And you might say, well, how can a guy who is so wealthy, Yasna Polyana, I'm sorry, Polyana, getting all mixed up with my Russian. But in any case, that's the largest state that he has south of Moscow. It's not Polyana. And it's still around today. Actually, it was not too long ago run by one of his ancestors. I don't know who's doing it now. But Tolstoy had this great estate, of course, aristocratic family. He inherited all this. And he inherited in a period when Russia still had serfdom, before the emancipation of the serfs in the early 1860s. And by the way, when they were emancipated, they were not really fully emancipated because they still had to compensate the landlord, their aristocratic lords. And that was a difficult thing to do. It wasn't like the state was getting involved to help them compensate these lords, the aristocrats, so that the serfs could become truly economically independent. So this would go on, and it would never really be resolved, even well into the 20th century. And some might say, well, it was even one of the factors in the Russian Revolution. Well, whatever. But Tolstoy, of course, had lots of sympathy for serfs. He would actually free them himself, and for which he thought that they would express a great deal of gratitude. They did not. They felt essentially that it should have been their land to begin with. At some earlier point in history, it had been forcibly taken from them, and they were simply being given back what was actually theirs to begin with. Well, in any case, Tolstoy also was an anarchist, and he felt that big government, essentially the big state, and of course we're talking about the states of the czars, we're talking about Alexander and Nicholas, and Alexander II in the days of Tolstoy. And Tolstoy lives in 1910, so he's actually living all the way into the days of Nicholas II, the last czar. So he believes, of course, not a hard thing to believe, that the czars were cruel, that the state was way too overimposing, and that the Russian Orthodox Church was simply a tool of the state, which often it was. It was a way of exploiting, it was a way of sort of dominating the serfs. So what's Tolstoy's anarchism all about? Well, two premises: his idea of Christianity and his idea of pacifism. He believed, of course, in a kind of, let's say, early Christianity, not church Christianity, but the Christianity of Jesus, right? That's what he looked back to. So he looked on sort of the original intentions of what Christianity really meant for people, and not just the doctrines that emerged with the history of Christianity. He also claimed that the state, like Proudhon and like all anarchists, was born from coercion. So he accepts the force theory that the state actually is the result of actual physical violence, and that's the basis of political power. And he thought that the state had always continued to use that violence, and that was the source of violence even in his own day. So the state was organized violence, and continued mainly to repress people in the name of a few exploiters who monopolized state power, of course, led by the czars. So armies were not only to be used against enemies, but armies were often used against the people themselves. And of course, Tolstoy was well aware that it was quite often the serfs who were actually fighting the wars, as well as armies being used against those very same people. He also believed that Christianity demanded peace and justice on earth, and if people would simply go back to the simplicity of religion, the simplicity of Christianity, that in fact, that people would be able to enjoy peace and prosperity. So bypass the state, bypass the church. It's almost as if Tolstoy is saying, just bypass history, and everybody could be free again, everybody could be at peace again. So it's interesting that Tolstoy, who actually represents the elite himself, but is feeling somewhat guilty about that, comes to that conclusion. So in terms of civil society, the state actually hinders that development. So you can see how Tolstoy actually was a believer in the goodness of humanity and the goodness of people if they simply be left alone by organized institutions. Tolstoy's anarchism has another interesting element, and that is that he believed that that people, once they become dependent on institutions, they become far less free. And when they become less free, they essentially are losing the most important part of their humanity. So institutions are not necessarily there to help them. Institutions are there to repress them. Institutions are obviously controlled by elites who do not have the best interest of the masses, to say the least. So in a sense, Tolstoy's saying these people at the top are actually parasites. Does he say, let's have a violent physical overthrow? No, that contradicts Christianity. But what he does believe is, let's simply ignore the state. People are essentially good. Why not just go back to who we really are and reclaim our identities? And so he believes fundamentally that we all become we lose our freedom, we lose our autonomy the minute that we become dependent on institutions. And example of that, Tolstoy believed that you had to learn you should learn the crafts. You should know how to produce your own food. You should know how, not that he went out and actually did all of that. You should know how to make your own clothing. You should be able to make boots. And by the way, he did know how to do that. He made his own clothing. Maybe not all of it, but maybe all of it. I don't know. But he actually knew how to use a loom. If you go to his home, which is still preserved as a museum in Moscow, you actually see the tools that he used himself. So put tools back in the hands of the people. Make them let them learn again the crafts which they were forgetting. Let them enjoy the fruits of their own labor on the land. And once people do that, once they would give up dependency on institutions, they would be free again. So in other words, bypass what some of my hippie friends in the 60s said: don't overthrow the state, ignore it. Set up your own commune, do what you want, produce your own food. They must have been followers of Tolstoy. And that's exactly what he believed. He did believe, of course, as I said, in the law of God. And that's what he means by Christianity. That's what he means that religion really should be all about. You should simply follow your conscience. You should read the Bible. You should understand the message that Jesus brought. And as far as the organized church, as far as the orthodoxy, well, that's not important at all compared to Jesus and compared to the real Christian ethic that comes from the life of Jesus. And with that, we'll call it a day. This is just a brief introduction, learning how to use the new tools, and I hope that I hope I've used them well. We'll see. So until next time, bye-bye.